There is a specific problem that the formation does not name directly. It addresses the problem through the disciplines it builds, the behavioral baseline, the cover maintenance, the specific techniques of operational identity management that every intelligence officer who works undercover must develop. The formation builds these disciplines carefully over years with the specific intention of producing someone who can maintain a cover identity so effectively that the cover does not require conscious maintenance. The goal is automatic. The goal is a cover that runs itself. The goal is someone who can be, in any given operational environment, whoever the operational environment requires them to be, without the performance being visible as performance. The formation achieves this goal. This is not in question. I am telling you now, from the room where I am recording this account, 31 years after the first operational posting, that the formation achieves exactly what it intends to achieve. The cover becomes automatic. The performance disappears into behavior. The identity the operation requires becomes, in the operational environment, the only identity present. The problem the formation does not name is what happens when the cover has run automatically for long enough that the question of which identity is the operational one and which identity is the actual one becomes not unanswerable. That is, too dramatic, becomes a question that requires deliberate effort to answer, that the answer is not immediately available, that you have to go looking for it, with the same systematic attention you would apply to any other assessment problem, and that the searching takes longer than it should. Budapest, in the autumn of 1993, was where I first had to go looking. The Danube, at Budapest, splits the city, Buda, on the west bank, Pest on the east, and moves south at approximately 2.1 meters per second in the central channel between the two halves, which is slightly faster than the Rhine at Bonn and significantly faster than the Thames at London. I registered this on the first morning of the Budapest posting, standing at the Margaret Bridge railing at 0715 hours, watching the gray-brown water move south. The temperature was 6 degrees Celsius. The breath vapor dispersed in approximately 1.8 seconds. The bridge railing was cold iron, not wet. Budapest in early October does not yet have the London moisture, but the cold was a different quality of cold from London cold, drier, with a specific crystalline property that the Central European continental climate produces as distinct from the maritime cold of the Thames. I registered all of this, received, registered, filed. The formation's first requirement in any new environment: map the water, the Danube, south, at 2.1 meters per second. The bank held. The cover for the Budapest posting was different from any previous cover I had operated under. Vienna had been defense attaché support, a cover that sat close to my actual institutional identity, that required minimal maintenance because the professional surface it presented was only slightly different from the professional surface beneath it. London had been similar. These were covers that the formation describes as thin, not in the pejorative sense, but in the technical sense of a cover whose distance from the actual identity is small, whose maintenance cost is low because the delta between what you are presenting and what you actually are is narrow. Budapest was different. Budapest required a thick cover. The specific cover I was operating under in Budapest, whose specific nature I will not disclose in this account, because the cover structure and the operational purpose it served involve institutional details that are not mine to make public, required the maintenance of an identity that was substantially different from the institutional identity I had been building since 1981, not in its surface features. The surface features were plausible and had been constructed with the specific thoroughness that the formation requires for thick covers: the documentation, the biographical history, the professional background that the cover identity carried into any room it entered. The surface was sound. The surface was not the problem. The problem was that the cover identity had been in operation across a period long enough that the automatic maintenance the formation aims for had achieved its goal. The cover was running itself. The cover was so fluent that the specific effort of being someone other than who I actually was had reduced to something indistinguishable in the operational environment from the specific effort of being who I actually was. The gap between the performance and the performer had closed. The formation had produced exactly what it intended to produce, and, in the specific quiet of a Budapest apartment at 2200 hours, with the Danube moving south outside and the 4100 Kelvin fluorescent light of the operational workspace overhead, I registered something that the formation had not given me vocabulary for. The gap had closed in both directions. The cover was no longer distinguishable from the identity beneath it. But the identity beneath it was also, in some dimension I could not immediately specify, no longer clearly distinguishable from the cover. I noted this. Made coffee. The water temperature was 90 degrees Celsius, correct extraction. The Budapest operational accommodation had provided a machine with more precise temperature control than Bonn or London. The extraction was correct. The coffee was correct. The question of which of the two identities currently operational in the 43 square meters of the Budapest apartment was the one I had arrived in Vienna with in 1986 was not immediately answerable. Received. Registered. The filing would take longer. Here is what a thick cover requires in the operational vocabulary the formation provides, and what it requires below that vocabulary in the register that the formation does not address. In the operational vocabulary, a thick cover requires consistent behavioral maintenance across all contexts. It requires that the biographical history of the cover identity be available on demand, not as recalled data but as lived experience, that when someone asks where you are from, you do not recall the answer from a memorized file. You produce it the way you produce information about your actual origins, with the specific fluency of someone describing a life they have actually lived. This requires practice. This requires the specific repetition that converts recalled data into behavioral automaticity. The formation provides the framework for this conversion. The conversion itself happens through the sustained application of the cover across operational time. What the conversion requires below the vocabulary is something the formation does not directly address. The conversion requires that you allow the cover identity to occupy the space that your actual identity occupies, not alongside it, occupying the same space. The cover cannot run automatically if it is running alongside a competing signal. The competing signal, the actual identity, asserting itself as distinct from the cover, is what makes cover maintenance effortful, visible, detectable. The cover becomes automatic only when the competing signal reduces. When the actual identity stops asserting itself as distinct and allows the cover to run in the space that assertion would otherwise occupy, this is the goal. The formation achieves this goal. What the formation does not address is what happens to the actual identity while the cover occupies its space. The formation does not address this because the formation is not designed to address it. The formation is designed to produce effective cover maintenance. The question of where the actual identity goes while the cover occupies its space is not an operational question. It is a question in the register below the operational vocabulary, which is where it has always lived, and where it requires answering not through the formation's tools, but through the kind of systematic attention that the formation's tools were built for. Applied to a problem the formation did not design them to address. Budapest was where I first applied those tools to that problem. The specific environmental data of Budapest in the autumn and winter of 1993 is relevant. Here, in the way that the Thames was relevant to London and the Rhine was relevant to Bonn, not as atmospheric decoration, but as calibration reference. Every operational environment I had inhabited had its specific physical signature, its water and its light and its temperature. And those specific physical signatures had become the external architecture within which the internal work of the posting was conducted. Pittsburgh had its rivers. Vienna had the Danube moisture. Bonn had the Rhine at 2 meters per second. London had the Thames at 1.2 meters per second. Tidal, brown, moving east. Budapest had the Danube, again not the Vienna Danube, which had been the wide gray winter river of 1987, but the Budapest Danube, the river that split the city at 2.1 meters per second and moved south, with the specific quality of a river that has been through a mountain range and is now moving through the plain with the accumulated momentum of a problem: descent. The chain bridge, the Széchenyi Lánchíd, was the crossing I used most frequently during the Budapest posting. At 0830 hours on a cold morning, the bridge has a specific quality of exposure. It sits approximately 8 meters above the Danube, with no shelter from the wind that moves along the river corridor. And the wind at that height carries the cold from the river surface with a directness that the street-level cold does not produce. I crossed the chain bridge at 0830 hours on 47 separate mornings during the posting. I registered the wind, temperature, and direction on each crossing. The registration was not operationally required. The registration was the formation running continuously, producing the specific kind of attention to physical environment that had been its output since 1981. What the 47 crossings also produced was 47 occasions on which the person crossing the bridge was, in the operational environment, the cover identity rather than the actual identity. The cover crossed. The cover registered the wind. The cover noted the Danube at 2.1 meters per second moving south below. The cover did all of this with the same quality of attention that the actual identity had been building since Pittsburgh, because the cover, by the time of the Budapest posting, had access to that quality of attention. The cover had inherited the formation's output. The cover could do what the formation had built the actual identity to do, because the actual identity had allowed the cover to occupy its space, and the space contained the formation's output along with everything else it contained. This is the specific mechanism I want you to understand, if you are willing to carry it. Not the philosophical problem of identity that is too large and too general, the specific operational mechanism. The cover inherits the formation's output. The cover uses the skills the formation built. And when the cover uses those skills, when the cover registers the wind on the chain bridge, when the cover maps the Danube's current, when the cover conducts the probability assessment and files the observation and continues the work is being done correctly. The operational output is valid. The cover's use of the formation's tools produces accurate results. The question that Budapest pressed into me at 2,200 hours in the 43 square meter apartment was not whether the work was being done correctly. The work was being done correctly. The question was, who is doing it? Let me tell you what I mean by that question, because I want to be precise rather than dramatic. The question was not existential in the philosophical sense. I was not experiencing a crisis of personal identity in the clinical or the colloquial meaning. The assessment machinery was functioning. The probability assessments were accurate. The cover was effective. The operational output was sound. By every external measure, the Budapest posting was proceeding correctly. The question was more specific than existential crisis. The question was about the direction of the calibration arrow. In every previous operational environment, the calibration had a clear direction. The actual identity was the calibration reference, and the cover identity was calibrated against it. The cover was the variable. The actual identity was the constant. When something in the operational environment required assessment, when a behavioral baseline deviation registered, when a probability calculation needed updating, when the environment presented a new pattern that required categorization, the assessment was conducted by the actual identity using the tools the formation had given it. And the result was the actual identity's conclusion. Budapest had flipped the arrow. Not completely, not permanently, but in the specific hours of 2200 at the 43 square meter apartment. In the specific quiet after the operational day's requirements had been met and the cover's social and professional maintenance had been completed and the external requirements had reduced to silence, the calibration arrow was pointing in the wrong direction. The cover was behaving as the constant. The actual identity was behaving as the variable. The assessments being conducted in the quiet were being conducted by someone who was using the actual identity as a reference point for understanding the cover rather than using the cover as a reference point calibrated against the actual identity. This is subtle. I want to be precise because imprecision here is the specific kind of imprecision that the formation's methods are designed to prevent in operational contexts. And the same precision applies when the methods are being applied to the problem of the formation's own output. The cover was assessing the actual identity. The cover was running the probability calculation on what the actual identity was treating the actual identity as the variable that needed calibration rather than the constant that provided it. This is what I mean when I say the gap had closed in both directions. The cover had not replaced the actual identity. The cover was assessing it. And an assessment requires a calibration reference. The calibration reference the cover was using was the cover itself. I drank the coffee. The extraction had been correct. 90 degrees. The Danube was moving south, outside, at 2.1 meters per second, indifferent to the calibration problem being worked on in the 43 square meters above it. The fluorescent light, at 4,100 Kelvin, was producing the institutional white that every government facility and operational workspace, in every posting, had produced the specific color temperature of the working world. The light of assessments and documentation and the sustained application of the formation's methods to whatever problem the operational environment presented. I was presenting the formation's methods with a new problem. The problem was the formation's own output. The middle of this account requires its question placed here, because the structure of these accounts puts questions where they are most likely to produce the specific quality of attention that questions placed at the beginning or the end do not produce. If you have operated under a cover, not in the intelligence sense necessarily, but in the broader sense of maintaining a version of yourself in a professional or social context that is substantially different from the version you inhabit when the professional or social context is not present, then you may recognize the specific problem Budapest presented. The question is this: when the performance has run long enough to become automatic, and the automatic performance and the actual behavior are indistinguishable, is the distinction between the performance and the actual behavior still meaningful? I have been asking this question since 2200 hours in a Budapest apartment in 1993. I have applied the formation's tools to it across 31 years of subsequent operational and post-operational experience. I have not produced a clean verdict. What I have produced is a probability assessment that I will share with you now, not as a conclusion but as the current state of a calibration that is still in process. The distinction is still meaningful. The performance and the actual behavior are not the same thing even when they are indistinguishable. They are indistinguishable because the performance has been built from the actual behavior. It has inherited the actual behavior's tools and its quality of attention and its specific capacity for sustained observation and pattern recognition. But the inheritance does not collapse the distinction between the inheritor and what was inherited from. The cover is built from the actual identity. The actual identity is not the cover. These are not the same statement in reverse. What Budapest required me to do, what the 47 chain bridge crossings and the 2,200-hour apartments and the Danube at 2.1 meters per second required was to build an internal mechanism for maintaining the distinction between the two things that had become indistinguishable, not to re-separate them. The formation had correctly collapsed the operational gap between them. The cover would not have been effective if the gap had remained visible. But to hold, internally, in the register below the professional vocabulary, the knowledge of which one was the constant and which one was the variable, even when the external environment could not tell the difference. This is harder than it sounds. The formation builds the collapsing of the gap. It does not build the internal holding of the knowledge that the gap has collapsed while maintaining the knowledge of which side of the collapsed gap you started on. That is architecture I built in Budapest across the autumn and winter of 1993 in 43 square meters at 2,200 hours. With the Danube moving south outside and the 4,100 Kelvin light overhead and the extraction correct at 90 degrees, Yusuf al-Rashid's file was still 47 words long. This is relevant here because the 47 words had been 47 words since 1988. And what was contained in those 47 words included a specific observation that I had made about al-Rashid's capacity to read a changing environment without the formation's specific tools. In Budapest in 1993, the formation's tools were being applied to the problem of the formation's own output. The irony was registered, filed alongside the 47 words, in the architecture that had been built for holding things that do not reduce. Budapest also introduced a figure whose specific weight in this account I will not reach until the next period, a Hungarian-born intelligence officer whose name I will not use, who was working in the specific post-communist institutional transition environment that made Budapest in 1993 a particularly complex operational geography. The transition from the Soviet-organized intelligence infrastructure to the structures that the new Hungarian state was building was producing, in 1993, exactly the kind of institutional gap that the formation's pattern recognition tools identified as a significant operational environment. The old structure had been thorough and well-resourced and had been operating for 40 years. The new structure was not yet cohesive. In the gap between the two, the specific kind of operational opportunity that post-transition environments reliably produce was present and available to anyone with the calibration to see it. I had the calibration. The cover had the calibration. Both saw it, which was the same seeing. The Hungarian officer, I will call him the architect, which is the designation the operational file assigned him before the formal assessment phase began, was 46 years old in the autumn of 1993. He had spent 21 years in the previous institutional structure. He had the specific quality of someone who had been thorough and effective within a system that no longer existed and was now determining, with the systematic attention of a person trained to make assessments under uncertainty, what his value was in the system that was replacing it. The assessment he was conducting was accurate. His value was real. The question was whether he would direct that value toward the institutional framework that was emerging, or toward the individuals and organizations who were operating in the gap before the framework consolidated. I registered the pattern, filed it. The architect's file was 23 words longer than Yusuf al-Rashid's file had been at the equivalent point in that assessment. This was noted. 23 words of additional weight at the earliest stage of the pattern recognition is a meaningful differential. The probability assessment assigned it the appropriate weight. The coffee was 90 degrees. The Danube was 2.1 meters per second. The cover was doing the assessment. The actual identity was holding the knowledge that the cover was doing the assessment. Both conclusions would be the same conclusion. The carrying structure held. It had been holding since Pittsburgh. It would continue to hold through what Budapest would place on it, and through what the remaining years of the 1990s would place on it, and through what 2003 would place on it. when Yusuf al-Rashid's 47 words arrived at their full weight. The autumn of 1,993 inches, Budapest has a specific atmospheric quality that the operational record does not contain, but that the register below the professional vocabulary has held since I was in it. The city was in the specific condition of a place that has recently been organized around one set of principles and is now being reorganized around a different set, and the reorganization is not yet complete, and in the gap between the old organization and the new one, something that is neither the old thing nor the new thing is present. Budapest in 1993 was alive with this in-between quality, the Habsburg architecture still standing, the Soviet period institutional infrastructure still largely present but no longer organized around the purposes it had been built for, the new frameworks of the post-communist European integration process present in the conversations and the institutions, and the specific quality of attention that the people I was working alongside brought to their professional lives. The in-between quality was familiar, not because I had been in Budapest before, I had not, but because the in-between quality is what every post-transition environment produces, and what the recalibration from Bonn and London had specifically equipped me to recognize. The formation had been built for a world organized around one set of principles. The world had reorganized around a different set. In the gap between the old organization and the new one, I had been building the vocabulary for the new patterns. Budapest was the first posting where that vocabulary was the primary operational vocabulary, rather than a supplement to the Cold War framework. The first posting where the recalibration was the main tool, rather than the backup. The main tool was sound. The main tool produced accurate assessments. The architect's file grew. The Danube moved south. The cover crossed the chain bridge at 0830. The actual identity held the knowledge of the crossing, and at 2,200 hours, in the 43 square meter apartment, in the 4,100 Kelvin fluorescent light, the question of which one is real was not answered. The question was held. The holding was the architecture. The architecture was the answer not to the question, but to the question of how you continue working when the question is open, and the work does not wait for the question to close. The work does not wait. It has never waited. In 31 years of asking which one is real, the work has continued without interruption. The assessments have been accurate. The probability calculations have been sound. The pattern recognition has produced conclusions that the subsequent operational record has confirmed. The cover and the actual identity have continued to occupy the same space, without resolution, without collapse, with the specific quality of two things that are distinct and indistinguishable simultaneously, which is not a contradiction. It is the specific operational condition that the thick cover produces and that the formation does not address, and that the architecture built in the quiet of operational postings holds. The bank holds. The water moves. Which one is real is not the question that determines whether the bank holds the gray operative. Every week, without exception, start from episode 1. The order is not a suggestion. It never was. And if you have been here since Pittsburgh, since the first episode, since the quality of attention that predates and anticipates and outlasts every cover identity that 31 years of operational work will produce, then you understand that the question this episode asked is not a new question. It has been present since the beginning. It has been carried since the beginning. The architecture has been built around it since the beginning. The order is the architecture. The architecture holds the question. The question does not close. The gray operative, every week, without exception. There is one more thing Budapest taught me that belongs in this account. And it belongs here rather than at the end, because the structure of the carrying means that certain weights are better placed in the middle of the account than at its close. The close is for what remains open. The middle is for what has been resolved, not fully, never fully in this work, but sufficiently. What Budapest resolved, sufficiently, was the question of how to maintain the direction of the calibration arrow when the gap has collapsed. The mechanism is this. You find an object in the operational environment that is not operational, not part of the cover, not part of the work, not part of the assessment, or the documentation, or the probability calculation. An object that exists in the operational environment with complete indifference to the operational purpose of the environment, something that registers to the cover and to the actual identity identically because it is not about either of them. It registers to both in exactly the same way, and the sameness of the registration is the data point that the mechanism requires. For Budapest, the object was the chain bridge at 0830 hours, not the cover's chain bridge crossing, not the actual identity's chain bridge crossing, the chain bridge itself, the wind, at 8 meters above the Danube surface. The specific temperature differential between the river surface air and the air at bridge height, approximately 2 degrees Celsius colder at height, which the formation would have filed as a meteorological observation and the cover would have filed as a contextual detail, and the actual identity would have filed as a calibration reference. All three filings were the same filing. The chain bridge did not register differently to the cover than to the actual identity. The Danube, at 2.1 meters per second, did not move faster for the cover than for the actual identity. The physical environment's indifference to the distinction between the cover and the actual identity was the calibration reference that maintained the distinction, because when both the cover and the actual identity produce identical registrations in response to the same stimulus, and you can observe both registrations simultaneously, you can use the simultaneous observation as evidence that there are two things observing. Two things producing the same output does not mean there is one thing. It means there are two things that are producing identical outputs. The chain bridge wind temperature was the same for both of them. The observation of that sameness was, mine belonged to the actual identity specifically, because the cover does not observe the sameness of its own registration with the actual identity's registration. The cover does not know the actual identity is also registering. Only the actual identity knows both registrations are occurring. This is the mechanism. The actual identity knows both are registering. The cover knows only the cover's registration. The knowledge that both are registering belongs to the actual identity exclusively, because it is the actual identity's capacity for meta-observation, for observing the observation that the cover has not inherited. The cover inherited the formation's observational tools. It did not inherit the meta-observational capacity that knows the tools are being used by two separate things simultaneously. That capacity remained with the actual identity. That capacity was the constant. I registered this at 0830 hours on the chain bridge in November of 1993. The temperature at bridge height was 4 degrees Celsius. The wind was from the south, carrying the river moisture at approximately 11 kilometers per hour. The Danube was moving south below at 2.1 meters per second. The cover registered all of this. The actual identity registered all of this, and also registered that the cover was registering it, and the registration of the registration was the data point that confirmed the calibration arrow's direction. Received, registered, filed. The mechanism worked. The winter of 1,993 inches. Budapest has a specific quality of light that is distinct from the autumn. The autumn light in Budapest is Central European in the way that the autumn light in Bonn is Central European gray, overcast, the sun at a low angle when it appears, the cloud cover producing the flat, even light that is the default atmospheric condition of the region in October and November. But the Budapest winter light from December onward has an additional quality that the Bonn winter does not have. It is the quality of a city at a lower latitude than Bonn, where the winter sun, when it appears, is genuinely low rather than merely seasonally low, and where the angle of the light on the stone of the buildings produces a specific warmth that is not the warmth of the light itself, but the warmth of the angle, the specific way that very low winter sun catches the face of a brand 19th century stone building and finds the texture that higher angle light does not find. I registered this in December of 1993, walking from the Pest side to the Buda side at 0830 hours on one of the 47 chain bridge crossings. The light was doing what it does in Budapest in December. The low-angle morning sun on the Castle Hill buildings on the Buda side. The specific warmth of the angle on 19th century stone at 830 inches December at this latitude. The temperature was -2 degrees Celsius. The Danube was moving south at 2.1 meters per second, the cold having made the water slightly more viscous than the autumn water, which the formation registered as a fractional reduction in current speed that was within the measurement margin and did not change the filed figure. The breath vapor dispersed in approximately 0.9 seconds, significantly faster than the Budapest autumn vapor dispersal, which had been 1.8 seconds. The cold December air, absorbing the moisture more rapidly than the merely cold October air. The cover crossed the bridge. The actual identity crossed the bridge. The December light was the same for both. The -2 degrees was the same for both. The 0.9 second vapor dispersal was the same for both. The registration of the sameness belonged to the actual identity. The calibration arrow pointed in the correct direction. This was the daily work of the Budapest posting. Not the operational work. The operational work was proceeding correctly. The architect's file was growing. The post-transition environment was being mapped with the vocabulary that the Bonn and London recalibrations had built. The institutional machinery was functioning as the institutional machinery functions. The daily work below the operational work was the maintenance of the calibration arrow's direction. The daily application of the mechanism find the object in the operational environment that registers identically to both. Observe both registrations simultaneously. Use the simultaneity of the observation as evidence of the actual identity's continued presence as the observing constant. The Danube at 2.1 meters per second. The chain bridge at -2 degrees. The 4,100 Kelvin fluorescent light at 2,200 hours in 43 square meters. The coffee at 90 degrees, correctly extracted. The Budapest machine's temperature control, producing the result that the Bonn and London machines had required adjustment to produce. All of it received. All of it registered. All of it filed by both. The filing of both filings belonging to one. There is a Yusuf al-Rashid note that belongs at the end of this episode. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is the thread that runs through all of these episodes and whose presence in the account is a form of honesty about what the Budapest period meant in the longer arc of the operational career. The 47 words were 47 words in December of 1993, as they had been 47 words in September of 1,988 inches, Bonn, when the file was opened. In the 5 years between the opening of the file and the Budapest posting, the file had not grown because the thread had not thickened. Al-Rashid had continued his cultural liaison work, had continued to demonstrate the specific environmental reading capacity that had produced the 47 words in the first place, and had not produced any additional data point that the probability assessment weighted as warranting additional documentation. What Budapest produced in December of 1993 was a 23rd word added to the architect's file that was, and I want to be precise about this, the same category of observation as the 47 words in Al-Rashid's file, but in a different operational context and with a different probability weight. The architect was reading a specific post-transition environment with unusual accuracy. Al-Rashid had read a specific geopolitical transition with unusual accuracy in 1988. The pattern of unusual environmental reading capacity in people outside the formation's specific training was a pattern that Budapest was adding a data point to. And the data point was noted in a separate file, not Al-Rashid's file, not the architect's file, but a third file, begun in December of 1993, that contained the observation that this category of unusual environmental reading capacity appeared to be a pattern rather than an anomaly. The third file was 11 words long in December of 1993. It would grow. It would not grow quickly. The thread was thin. The patience required was the patience of the bank at the river, not the patience of waiting for the water to stop moving, but the patience of holding position while the water moves, and continuing to hold position when the water moves in a direction that was not anticipated, and registering what the unanticipated movement carries, and filing it in the appropriate place in the architecture. The bank holds. The water moves. The gray operative. Every week, without exception. End quote.